It's obviously an enormous pleasure and honor to be here and to share the stage with such a remarkable group of writers who are impressive, and I have no idea why I'm the one here, but they're incredible people to be associated and affiliated with. And of course, thank you to the Vilcek Foundation and the Housing Works. I used to come here when I first moved to New York, and I did a lot of my writing right there because it was great, and because all the things go to charity, I never felt bad about having a beer in the middle of the day. And I still don't feel bad about having a beer in the middle of the day, but it was better to do it in this context than any place else. I'm going to read from my second novel, How to Read the Air. And it's a novel narrated by Ethiopian immigrants, or by the son of Ethiopian immigrants named Jonas Wildemariam, who's been raised in America, but is very much haunted and sort of damaged by his family's past and by the sort of legacy of violence that his parents brought with them from Africa into America. And the passage I'm going to read from is the narrator sifting through this box of artifacts from his father after his father's death. And he's trying to sort of puzzle out who this man was, and at the same time who he is as a result of that. So I think that's enough. Once I had the few remaining objects of my father's life in front of me, I knew that I would eventually open up the box and plunge into what had been the quiet madness of his last years. Knowing that, I held off for as long as possible. I made myself a cup of tea, after which I checked the hallway to see if my neighbor had picked up a newspaper for the day. He hadn't, and so I brought it inside and read quickly through the headlines while sipping my tea. I had never done it before and had no reason for doing so now, but I checked as well the daily index of stocks, bonds, and commodities on the back pages of the business section. I said out loud to no one, since I was alone, "Look at that. Gold has gone up again." I tried again a few seconds later with the stock listed as WSK, which I'd posted yesterday, a rather significant, and I'm sure to many people, disappointing loss. For a few more seconds, I became one of them. "Come on, WSK," I said. "You're killing me here." And while I still couldn't see myself as one of those severely tailored men in suits who marched around Manhattan, I did begin to think that perhaps the difference between us weren't so great after all. We all had fathers, and some of us even had dead fathers. And speaking of dead fathers, here was what was left of mine, sitting just a few feet away in a cardboard box, the only true and proper resting place for a man like that. That was the only way I could think of approaching my father's belongings, through indirect, oblique angles, as if I had just stumbled upon them at a party. Long-lost friends I hadn't thought of in years and whose names I was struggling to remember. I had to walk around them, ignore them, and pretend as if they were all just part of another normal working day for someone like myself, a stockbroker or an analyst in training. I didn't expect to find any letters or a journal that my father had kept. He was hardly the type for sentimental preservation, and was never one to state his thoughts directly. What I did find, however, could be considered a record of events, or a loose journal of thoughts. My father, as it turned out, was a drawer. Not a particularly talented one, but a drawer nonetheless. Of the hundreds of pieces of loose paper floating around the bottom of the box, almost all contained sketches of boats of various shapes and sizes that he had made. There were sailboats, tugboats, and freight ships, speedboats, and a few ocean liners that appeared to be sketched from a catalog. There were boats hovering alone in the middle of a blank white page, and others that were drawn out at sea, complete with waves and a stretch of land in the corner. A few were barely larger than the corners of the pages they occupied, while some nearly stretched across all four corners and were intricately designed with portholes, anchors, and flags blowing in the wind. There were dozens of sketches of three-dimensional boxes floating around them, as if my father were trying to find a way of fitting those boxes inside the boats themselves. This is what he saw and thought of every day. Boats coming and going, unloading their goods or bringing new ones on board. Some of the more detailed ones must have been drawn up close, perhaps only a few feet away, or maybe from the boats themselves. It was an easy walk, entirely downhill, from the YMCA to the piers. He must have made it often while he was still alive. The pictures nearest the top were barely sketches, spare, with only the general outline of a ship near the bottom left-hand corner. They have the air of having been drawn from a distance, both physical and emotional, that speaks to the way my father must have lived those last few years. There are a number of ways of looking at those drawings. The first and easiest would be to say that they were pictures of things that he saw every day. And perhaps the last and most sentimental would be to say they express some deep eternal longing to be carried away, some profound private knowledge of death, which was just around the corner, an echo of the river Styx and the final passage we all make out of life. I knew at the time that I would make of them what I wanted depending on the mood and on occasion. And on that particular day, they were signs that my father had never ceased to try to capture the moment everything in his life seemed to go wrong. Besides the pictures, that box contained one last interesting memento. A small bundle of photographs of him in front of various monuments taken all over the world. There he is in Rome, outside the Colosseum, and in Athens, next to the Parthenon, and in Paris with the Eiffel Tower looming large in the background. In each picture, he's wearing almost the exact same outfit. Dark brown slacks with a beige button-down shirt with a brown vest over it. He looks something like a cowboy, one misplaced and lost in time. The pictures must cover at least a year, maybe even two. In one, he's holding a small suitcase as he stands next to a cot, which explains why in part his outfits over the years hardly varied. It was the one decent set of clothes he had. And if a picture of him was going to be taken, then it had to be taken in the best possible light, with the finest clothes he owned. What surprised me most about the content was how little they revealed. If my father was a stranger before, he seemed even more so now that I had caught a glimpse of his final thoughts. It wasn't supposed to have worked out like this. According to the stories, children who opened boxes containing the last precious items of their parents were always granted some vital, significant revelation. A dark secret uncovered. Family histories are supposed to be riddled with such things. For without them, how do we achieve that much-needed catharsis we're all supposedly longing for? But then I thought that was the problem all along, that before a family's secret or past can be revealed, there has to be a family to begin with. And what we were was something closer to a jazz trio, a performance group that got together every now and then to play a few familiar notes before dispersing back to their real private lives. By this time, it was nearing 8 p.m., and I knew my wife, Angela, would be home from work. If I stayed home, we would have sat through another dinner straining at all times to pretend as if something horrible wasn't happening to our marriage. I had no extra energy to spend, and so rather than wait for her, I tucked about a dozen or so of my father's sketches into my pocket and headed out west in the direction of the piers along the Hudson River. It didn't particularly matter which one, so as long as I could stand as close as possible to the river's edge. The idea had struck me that it was time to see if my father's boats were seaworthy. I wanted to know if they could float. I know that I'm saying that somewhat disingenuously, which is how I said it back then, but I needed a premise to begin with. Something to justify my walking out of the apartment alone towards the piers on a dark November night. I felt that I couldn't say to someone if asked, "I'm going to take a walk along the Hudson," without somehow implying that I was up to something mysterious or perverted, even though the piers had shed their transvestite prostitutes and their little gangs of effeminate boys who had no money and nowhere to go. Nor could I casually say, "I'm going to walk along the piers now so I can be closer to my father, whose life and death I've been ignoring for too long. If you don't mind, I'd like to be alone." I needed an emotional cover, and those sketches provided it. For the third straight day, the unseasonably warm temperature had held, and even though it was November, for the second time in as many nights, I walked with my jacket slung over my shoulder, both mildly surprised and delighted to see that tables and chairs had been set up outside, that people were dining and smoking, and that since night came early, many were already drunk. It was festive and panicked. Car radios and boom boxes were playing loudly. There were more than a dozen kids standing outside the steps of the old tenement houses. Since we knew it wouldn't last much longer, we seemed to be trying that much harder to hold on to these last traces of summer and fall. And there was something about our collective efforts that was ultimately frustrating and futile. I noticed that as I walked, I was breathing in deeper, trying to concentrate inadvertently on the smell of the air, while at the same time making sure to take note of every mild breeze that blew my way. By the time I had reached the pier, I was tempted to almost yell, "Enough of this. Let's get back to our normal everyday lives." But then I reached the water, and even with the lights from New Jersey streaming in from across the river and the blare of traffic behind me, I thought that this was a beautiful and magical place. This island that, despite its massive numbers and seemingly crushing density, still let you reach its borders so easily, almost as a consolation prize for enduring the brute force with which it could sometimes bear down on you, as if to remind you that you always have the option to leave, and at the same time come back should you care to. Stop there.